we do want teams to feel pressure. That's
Yeah.
good. That's healthy. That's what a high functioning organization is
Yeah.
doing. But they shouldn't feel like they're sort of despair and there's no way they're ever going to accomplish
Yeah.
this thing, because that's not, it doesn't lead to effective action. I think the number one thing though is creating that ownership. When
Yeah.
you create ownership, a lot of things that might have felt like despair don't feel that way, because you feel like you're an owner. You feel like you're responsible for your outcome. And so that sort of earlier conversation around defining ownership allows you to to put people under, some amount of pressure, and them to actually feel great about it.
One of the things we think about is, I think, even starting from the top, right, really defining the role of a product manager, right? That's something that I think very different people have different views. Anywhere from the PM is the CEO of the product, to the PM is arbiter of priorities, to there are many different definitions based on what the specific need for the company is. And as you know, and been using the product, our company is very much consumer focused, and it's very much in the business of building trust for members and solving problems and delivering value. So it's very consumer or member centric. And so we think about product with that lens. And what we're trying to, do here is really provide an experience that people get out of it and say, wow, that really helped change my life. And something that I want to actually use as part of my wellness journey for many years to come. It's not something that is just here and now, and I learn something and walk away, but really something that will become a core staple and a trusted partner in people's health journey, specifically metabolic health. So kind of that's our North Star. And obviously we're building towards that. And really right now we're focused on helping that 30, 90 day to a year experience to make sure people really understand how food affects their health, and build from that into something that becomes a core part. So first with that context, the first question is, what is a role of a product manager in that world? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, what do you view a product manager's role to be?
Yeah, I mean, I'd sort of caveat everything with, my experience was not really on the consumer side, more on B2B, but I do think this is sort of at least the way I've always thought of the product role. And it's a little bit different than that. Hey, you're the CEO of that product line, and I think a lot of times product managers sort of get the wrong idea of what they're supposed to be doing and how they're supposed to be operating within a team. And so I think there's both how I describe it as your role within the team, and then the objectives you're trying to carry out for your customer. And within the team, I always sort of say, like, the role of the product manager ultimately is to look around the team to see what really needs to be done for that team to be successful with whatever their goal is in the organization. See what isn't getting done that needs to be done for that team to be successful,
Yeah.
and ultimately it's to go figure out either who should be doing it or do it yourself. And the way I sort of think about it is there was this TV show back when I was growing up called Quantum Leap. I don't know if you're
No.
familiar with this show, but like, in Quantum Leap, he would basically materialize inside of someone's body and then would need to
Yeah.
figure out what he's doing. And part of why I wanted the product all along was that sort of notion of, you're a jack of all trades and master of none. And I think
Yeah.
product managers tend to be that on their team. They have a bit of business skills, but they're not, the BD person. They have technical skills, but they're not writing code every day. And they have, obviously some experience in pricing and evaluating business performance and metrics, but generally they're not in finance, right? And so you tend to be the sort of jack of all trades, master of none. That's sort of the role. And what makes you most impactful, I find, in teams and organizations is seeing what really needs to be done that isn't currently assigned to someone, either going and doing it yourself if it's
Yeah.
appropriate, or making sure that someone in the organization is putting attention on that thing that still needs to be done. And I say that to say, because I think a lot of times folks start with that, like, you're the CEO of the product mindset.
Yeah.
And that lends them, I think, down the wrong path, which is like, hey, I'm the boss.
Yeah.
And that's not actually your role on the team. Your role on the team is to help the team be successful and do whatever it takes to make that happen. And And so I think it's when you say CEO, I think doesn't generate the behavior that I found creates the most
Yeah.
effective PMs in the organization. So that's sort of one way I always talk about like your role within the team is just look around, see what needs to be done, and if no one's doing it, you should be doing it, or find someone else to do it in the organization. And I always joke with folks, oftentimes it's like, listen, the team's staying late and no one's ordered pizza at the office, or whatever the working from home equivalent of that is like those are the things you should be thinking about as a product leader in that team. Is just like, what
Yeah.
does the team need? How do we help each other? And I think when product managers approach the job that way,
Yeah.
their role within the team, it's actually you create a lot more trust within your team.
Yeah.
And folks are surfacing a lot more things that they think are broken to you, even if it's not something that is within their control, but it might be something that you know how to go ahead and solve. And so I like to talk about people working within their teams that way.
Yeah.
You're sort of a servant for the team and making sure that they're most successful. I think ultimately, though, like your role within the role within the company is around making sure that you're advocating for the needs of the customer.
Yeah.
And I think in some companies, you have a pretty clear understanding of what the needs of the customer are. You may be a customer of the product yourself. In other environments, that's not the case. And so, I always sort of work from how do we make sure that we have a team that's advocating for what our customers are really advocating for, independent of all the other things that are going on, and making sure that product managers see that that is their responsibility ultimately. Are you spending time with the customer support team and understanding what challenges customers are seeing every day? Are you thinking about the needs of customers you might not even have today? Doing
Yeah.
interviews on prospective customers and really advocating on behalf of customers. And so, at Twilio, a lot of our product management team really had come from technical backgrounds, and many of them had actually been, CTOs of a startup before they joined Twilio.
Yeah.
And that was something I really looked for because that's who our customer was. We're selling to developers, and so I wanted folks on the team that knew what it was like to build and
Yeah.
knew what it was like to write code every day. And so I think what the profile of that person looks like may vary team to team and depending on the type of problem that you're solving. But I think the biggest thing they need to be doing is advocating for the needs of the customer, is sort of what they should be injecting into the team. And then with respect to the team, it's figuring out what all needs to be done that isn't being done today, that's blocking the team from being successful and making sure that gets resolved.
Yeah.
As I said, it's this sort of jack of all trades, master of none. You need
Yeah.
to really just embrace that as a product manager and
Yeah.
just assume if something isn't getting done that's really critical for the company, for the customer, and for the team, like that's on you to go figure out how to make it happen.
Yeah, I really love how you reframe the concept. I think CEO is a shorthand, and I really like how you reframe the concept of servant leadership, which is I'm here to help people get their job done most efficiently within the team, and also make sure that we extract the needs from our members. So really, they're serving the member and serving the team to get the job done effectively. And I think the concept of CEO, you're right, can be conflated with the person in charge versus the person that their role, they're going to own the outcome, right? They see themselves as the owner of the success of whatever feature or product they're working on. And to do that, they're basically serving both, number one, obviously the member, because if you don't get the need right and understand it and not their advocate, kind of miss the mark automatically. And then second is once you understand that, how can I help the team achieve what they need to do? If it's people are working really late and need a pizza, that's what it is. If it's, understanding, there's friction between product and design and engineering, figuring that out and making sure that people are really working at their best. That seems to be the theme I witness, and I think what you just explained.
Absolutely. And I think that ownership concept, I think, is super important. And as I said, every team looks quite different depending on what type of problem you're trying to solve on behalf of customers. Some teams, at Twilio were design heavy because there was user interface, onboarding, those types of things. And some teams were like, listen, we're doing, the API infrastructure and our customer is, cares about, latency and they care about, rotating tokens. And so it isn't super heavy. And so you don't have a ton of design folks on those teams. And so I think the makeup of the team needs to sort of ultimately be geared towards the problem that team is chartered, with solving and that they own the outcome for.
Yeah.
But the role of the product manager needs to be flexible enough that in a team with a designer, you're having the appropriate role. In a team that has maybe, maybe owns a business metric, you have the appropriate role. And so there are various different ways to be that, but ultimately, I think you need to be an owner. You need to be responsible for that outcome. And I think, in fact, one of the biggest failure modes, and I've made this mistake as I've structured teams in the past, is
Yeah.
giving someone ownership and responsibility for a problem that they actually can't own. That requires too many, like, well, to get that done, we need to go up the chain and then back down the chain, and
Yeah.
they're not really autonomous to go after whatever that objective is that they own.
Yeah.
And so, one of the big things I tell folks is, like, you want to make sure that when you're giving someone a problem, you're chartering them with ownership over a particular problem that they have end-to-end ball control around solving, right? And you don't want to find yourself in a spot where it's like they actually can't actually achieve those goals with, the resources that they have in front of them. And we want to be creating owners, but also giving them a scope and autonomy within that area so that they can be responsible for those outcomes and you can hold people accountable. And I think a lot of failure modes in product teams, both that I've made mistakes of in the past, and have been a function of this, like, hey, you own something, but you don't actually own it. And it's a shared responsibility across
Yeah.
15 different teams. And the PM is just sort of only negotiating all day long and but not actually accountable. And I think that can be a failure mode in a lot of organizations.
Yeah. So how do you handle that? Because I mean, most of our stuff, most of our product features are going to be cross-functional. They're going to
Of
touch
course.
many functions, anywhere from ops to engineering to design, data science, clinical. Like it's going to touch many, many aspects. So almost most features, unless it's a small one, is going to be cross-functional, and they have to go up, down, and sideways. And how do you manage that with giving them enough autonomy and support, really, as you know, as the leadership? How do you give the product manager enough support to be able to own it, right? Because ultimately all those functions have a part to play, but there's only one person that needs to say, yep, I think we can get it delivered, and really minds the gaps, right? The gray areas are the ones that, if you don't have a single point of responsibility, or what we call a directly responsible individual, DRI, if you don't assign a DRI that has that control, there's a lot of gray and a lot of trade-offs that you need to make between the different teams that nobody would own, and therefore your product feature would fail. How do
Yeah.
you solve for that?
Yeah, I think it is in how you break down the problems as a leader. And listen, nothing's perfect here, right? So I'll sort of caveat with, like, you will get this wrong. This is always the case, and there's always, the 20% that it's like is negotiation ultimately,
Yeah.
and but you want to try to make sure it's the bulk of the work isn't that. And so I can give you sort of a concrete example, and in the patterns that I would look for. One, anytime I found the organization sort of self-creating a committee for a thing, I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
I probably did something wrong here as a leader. If the only way we're solving this is some sort of weird committee that's been set up, it's like there's probably not the appropriate
Yeah.
responsibility and ownership here that a committee needs to be put in place. And so I was like, one of the organizational words I would listen for is like, oh no, we have a committee that's solving that. I'm like, committees don't solve things particularly efficiently,
Yeah.
and so that was sort of one just warning sign for me. But I'll give you sort of a concrete example from some time at Twilio to give you an idea of it. Is you don't have a team that's responsible for. So we had two key product lines at Twilio in the early days. We had the voice product line and the messaging product line. Those are, I think most people think of messaging exclusively when they think of Twilio, but as a sizable business doing voice communications.
Yeah.
So we had two different product lines. They had very different needs, right? What customers wanted was very, very different. And an example of sort of a failure mode that we did go down a path on, and ultimately I think course corrected, was like having a user interface team, right? So like, a user interface team is not a useful thing in the sense that the customer problems of voice users were very, very different than the customer problems of messaging users. And yes, they had some overlap between them for sure, but they had very, very different needs. And so you end up in this spot when you create ownership, and this is sort of one of those like ownership areas that, like, you can't, no matter what you do, someone's upset. Either you spend the time for the voice folks and the messaging folks are upset, or you do vice versa, right? And you have sort of two folks that are never going to be happy, I joke it's like prioritizing between an apple and a pizza. Like, is an apple good? Yes. Is a pizza good? Yes. They're good at very different times, right? Um, but you could probably more reasonably prioritize between an apple and a banana, right? You might have a preference. You might be able to say, oh, no, no, I want a banana, because they're more alike. And so you want to sort of enable product owners to be prioritizing between apples and bananas,
Yeah.
not apples and pizza.
Right.
And so ultimately, what we ended up doing there was, instead of being the user interface team, they became the team that built the toolkit for the other teams to actually build user interfaces. So that the other teams would require way less resources to build whatever user experience they wanted to build, because there was an entire tool chain that was built by this other team. And that way, then you don't dictate to the product owners, let's say on the messaging team or on the voice team, what their user interface needs to look like. No, you dictate the tool chain. You dictate, what the Twilio user experience ought to be like, and
Yeah.
then they should know their own customers far better than a shared user interface PM for what their needs are, because they're talking to their customers every day about what they want from messaging versus what they want from voice. And that sort of example, I mean, is you need to frame the problem in a way that you don't have the user interface team. Instead, what you have is the front end toolkit team,
Yeah.
right? And their goals are, very, very geared towards, okay, that, we even did internally at Twilio as we started to build these things. You would get NPS from the teams that consumed your services. Like,
Yeah.
those are your customers at the end of the day, even,
Yeah.
and so you try to basically goal them around the something that they can own.
Yeah.
And it may mean, in this case, we had to put some, customer, user experience resources into the messaging team and into the voice team. But the reality is those teams are taking those resources anyway,
Yeah.
because they're asking for certain features to be built. And so rather than centralizing all of them in one place that had all the designers, it's like, no, there's a team that works on the design toolkit and user interface components, and then there's a set of team that is responsible for the different experiences in those products. And then there's a set of things that were shared in the Twilio product, like login, right? It's like, well, great, they actually can own login, because I don't think the messaging team cares a ton about what that login experience looks like. And so that's sort of an example of creating the right ownership rather than saying you own user interface.
Yeah.
It's too, there are too many constituent parties that you can't please any of them.
Conflicting. It's almost like, you want to build the Rails and then allow the product managers to use the Rails to create the purpose-built feature.
And that was the pattern, I think, that when I look back on my time, that was a pattern that, like, you always are too late to embrace that.
Yeah.
And then after you do it, you're like, man, I really should have done that a lot long ago, right? You're always like, well, we don't have enough people, because it's a little bit, it is a bit resource inefficient, right? It tends to require a little bit more people to move independently and autonomously rapidly. But if you're on this trajectory where you're continuing to scale, you're doubling your organization size every 6 months or something like that, then like really the time to do it is actually before you're experiencing the pain from it, not after. And it actually can be difficult when you're after, because then you're in a spot where you're a bottleneck. And that was another big thing we look for. So I mentioned, looking for things like the committee. The other thing is, like, just anytime something seemed bottlenecked by the same team over and over and over again, I think that people's natural inclination is like, is there a performance issue with that team?
Yeah.
I actually think the opposite. It's frequently, did management scope their responsibilities in a way that they're too large or have too many competing priorities that you're asking them those teams to prioritize between Apple and pizza, rather than things that are more similar. And frankly, I think you end up with better outcomes when you ask a team to prioritize Apple and pizza. It's like, it's kind of just a crapshoot as to what gets prioritized and why. And I think you frequently end up with a situation where it's like the person that is yelling the loudest ends up winning, and that's not what's right for customers at the end of the day. And so a lot of what I think you should be doing as a effective product leader is making sure that you're breaking down ownership responsibilities where your teams can be effective.
Yeah, it makes sense. It seems like at least on the product side, needs to be atomic versus creating one monolithic team that has different priorities and different objectives, and now they're getting pulled between the two. um, where they can't make decisions between two things that are completely different. So context matters, but they can't disambiguate that. I think between bananas and apples, I would definitely go for apples if you're using a.
I'm more of an apples guy as well, but it depends. Some days I like a banana. There's certain if I'm doing a race, something like that, I want some potassium.
That was one of my big learnings when I had a banana and I saw a 70-point jump. And
Yeah,
bananas are out for me.
yeah, yeah. Unless it's race day, I'm not touching a banana.
It ruined bananas for me for sure. Um, one of the things that I think we've been also trying to refine is, in reflecting on this, product managers in our group kind of have three roles. One is really understand what the need of the member is. And be able to stack rank it, right? The problems that we need to solve to address metabolic health, like what are they, right? Really understanding that. The second one is really being able to translate that into product specs. And that's a skill that people develop over time. How do I break it into the right size? How do I communicate it correctly to engineering? How do I phase it? That's a skill that's very unique to product managers, to be able to really distill a need down to something that people can build. And then the third part is really interfacing with engineering and make sure things are on track and make sure that we're delivering to what we expected. And then obviously doing retros and test it and refine it, right? It seems like those have been the role that RPMs have played. Does that sound right to you? I know it's different in maybe a different business model where maybe it's not as design heavy, but does that sound right to you based on what
Yeah, I think that's the right way to think about it. I think one of the big challenges that I see in where things can go off the tracks in that process is there's first and foremost, like, do you really understand the needs of the customer? And I think every product manager could spend more time with customers at the end of the day. And I think sometimes folks are like, no, I really get it. But customers come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. The needs of enterprise customer of Twilio are very, very different than the needs of a startup, for example, of Twilio. And sort of, a developer that signed up with their credit card versus someone that needs to go through procurement. They have like very different processes and security requirements, et cetera. And so I think a lot of it starts with just making sure you understand the customer. And I always encourage my team, like, you should be using the product every day, right? And as I said, I hired mostly technical PMs because we had a technical customer, and folks knew this about me. Like, before we launched any product, I would use it. I would typically break their product in some way, shape, or form. They're like, "Oh, crap, Patrick's using this thing in a way we didn't intend," and so like I filed a lot of early bugs, but for me that was about making sure I had the customer empathy, and making sure that I was a user of the product as well. I think it's hard to be a good product manager if you don't really understand the needs of the customer, and so doing everything you can to put yourself in their shoes, I think is really, really important. I think the next point you talked about is like, all right, now how do I go from I do understand the needs of the customer, and then how do I sort of go to sort of the next step? What do we invest in? What do we prioritize? I think I think that's where actually a lot of bad product decisions get made. I think in general, folks understand like customer empathy is key to this job. But I think there's, a step where, what we would do, and we stole this from Amazon, so it's certainly not novel from Twilio, but we would write the press release before we made any sort of new product investment. We'd sort of start off like, first, what do we think the customer needs are? Spend time with customers and understand that. And then it was like, all right, can we simply articulate what we're trying to solve? And can we do it in a way that's understandable by both you write it as a press release, so will customers understand it? But also, if we can write it in a way that's simple enough that our own customers are going to understand, likely all the other parts of our organization are going to understand it, right? The people in finance that are like, wait, why do we need this many engineers to go solve this problem? It's like, well, hey, can you read this thing? And it's a one-page doc. It's very, very straightforward. It should be pretty clear what you're trying to solve, and that document is as much to get clarity in your own mind around what you're investing in as it is to then prove be a point of reference for everyone else in the organization going forward. And so we would spend a lot of time on getting those right before we dove into writing a PRD and sort of going down the breaking down the problem any further. It was like, are we solving the right problem? Is this the problem that customers care about? And there were a lot of times where we'd write that and then we wouldn't invest. We would like, and it would, sometimes it'd sit on the shelf and we'd say like, maybe we should invest in that later. It was, we
Yeah.
are well articulated the problem, but when we got there, we're like, oh, well, maybe we should solve this other problem over here. And so we would spend a lot of time on that process
Yeah.
before we would even jump into stuff like a PRD.
Yeah.
And then the other thing we would do as pre-work before getting into requirements is we had a process, and this I think was probably unique to Twilio, but we called it write the docs first.
Yeah.
So since our product ultimately was an API,
Yeah.
we would write all the API documentation first,
Interesting.
as though this was like a public, any developer could show up and just sign up for it. We wrote all the documentation. We had code
Yeah.
samples. We had, and next thing I know, we're arguing over API design and a bunch of things like that. When you're like, oh, well, those are the wrong codes. I would do it this way,
Yeah.
and we were pretty meticulous about doing that before we'd even invest in the product. We wanted to see what it looked like. And I think in non API businesses, I mean, this is sort of wireframing, rapid prototyping,
Yeah.
doing those types of things well before you've invested in a lengthy PRD document. Because I think a lot of times folks will fall in love with the PRD that they wrote and all the time and effort they put into that, rather than staying focused on what they should be on early on, which is like, hey, a bunch of this stuff could potentially get thrown away. This is discovery.
Yeah.
And we're trying to validate this. And we would take the docs back to customers that, we thought would be good users of that feature. Like, hey, there's a new feature coming out. It's not yet available, but we do have the docs ready to go. We're curious just to take a look at what you
Yeah.
think. What's missing? What would you add?
Yeah.
And so we would spend a lot of time in sort of that iteration mode.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing I often told folks in my organization is like, listen, good product managers will cut their own features,
Yeah.
right? Like they will realize they go down the path. Someone in the organization said, hey, we need to solve this. They
Yeah.
go explore it and they find out like, no, it's actually not the right solution. There might be this other solution over here that we should actually pursue. And that's okay. And you shouldn't be afraid of spending the time fleshing out what the thing is and deciding, hey, this probably isn't the right investment for us, and here's why. That's actually a sign, I think, of a healthy product manager and a healthy product team, that they sort of went after something and they came to a different conclusion that actually more important is to solve this other thing over here, right? So those were some of the things we would do before we ever got to that PRD. And then the last thing we did in that prep work is we tried to give it like a code name that clearly was not going to be the actual name. We would just sort of make something up that was like, if anyone was reading that thing, they'd say like, of course, that's not the name of the product, right? Because
Yeah.
when products or features, when they get a name, they take on a life of their own.
Yeah.
And that's when I think, the people working on them can get attached to them. And
Yeah.
I always tell product managers, a lot of what product managers do gets thrown away, and that's okay.
Yeah.
The idea is your work gets thrown away, not a bunch of engineers. And that's the way you need to be thinking about, the job that you're doing, is that there is going to be waste in the work that you're doing, but ideally there's a lot less waste for the rest of the organization as a result. And so those are some of the things that we did early on before we even got to PRD. Is we really sort of spent a lot of time up front, so that by the time the PM is investing in that PRD and they're pulling in an engineering manager and talking through a bunch of the details on it, it's
Yeah.
like we feel pretty good that that's a thing that we want to build.
Yeah. How do you think about capacity then in resourcing? All that takes a lot of time and resources and thinking. Or obviously, it's good to do it because it's a levered play, right? If they spend a couple of product managers doing that, it's much better than a whole team of engineers building and throwing it away. But then, how do you think about staffing your product teams to be able to do that? Obviously, there's a ton of work to go into figuring out what the need is, distilling it down, writing the press release, creating the mocks, getting user feedback, iterating. How do you think about capacity of product managers to be able to do that and not take shortcuts?
Yeah, I mean, I think one just sort of pattern I always look for is like the best product managers I know just seem to have an absurd amount of capacity. They're the first to respond to every email. They're just, the type of people that I think are attracted to doing that type of work
Yeah.
tend to just be very efficient with their time,
Yeah.
and very, very focused and able to get a lot more done than you might think. And I think,
Yeah.
you know, the ultimately, I think, you run the risk if you have too much product capacity, which I think is far more damaging than too little. You
Yeah.
run the risk that ultimately, people are creating work that doesn't really need to be done.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, I always talk about product managers is product managers create work, engineers, solve it, right? And as you're growing as a business, as a company, and trying to improve your product, you do need to create
Yeah.
work. But that
Yeah.
is the role of product. And so if you have too many product managers, you're going to have way too
Not.
many things not getting done.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's good for the product managers either. They're
Yeah.
feeling demotivated that they don't get a lot done. So I tend to sort of the ratio that we operated at Twilio was about 10 to 1, 10 engineers. And I say engineers loosely, it's sort of 10,
Yeah.
10 folks doing the work. Sometimes that's designers, sometimes that's, DevOps, sometimes that's a bunch of different roles within an organization to sort of one person creating the work. And that's sort of, generally how I
Yeah.
would look at it. I think different problems require a little bit of a different ratio. And so I think every business is different. But I think that's a healthy balance. And I think generally, what I found is that oftentimes we would sort of, the PM would sort of go out ahead exploring an area, and sort of uncover a bunch of different things that were there. And then they would have to make the case to the organization that we actually need to staff a team against this.
Yeah.
And so there were a bunch of times where there was a product manager on an area and not yet any engineers on it. And I think that's fine.
Yeah.
But I think if you add too many PMs into the
Yeah.
team, I actually think it can be problematic
Yeah.
because they're creating work that isn't necessarily the highest priority work that the organization needs to be tackling.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think about that experience, and also designers in the same boat, right? If you have too many designers and too
Yep.
many PMs, then you're creating work that never gets done, and so they feel like they're churning.
Yeah,
Uh, Also, I think constraints breed focus as well,
absolutely.
and so really being wise with your resources. One of
I
the
think that's true with engineering as well. Actually, I think the constraints breeding focus. I think we ran a lot of teams hot,
yeah.
at Twilio is sort of the way that we would talk about it. But man, you'd be surprised if what folks are able to accomplish when
Yeah.
they know they have limited resources and they
Yeah.
need to make super hard prioritization decisions to achieve a particular objective. Teams will always surprise me
Yeah.
as to what they were capable of doing, with a fairly small, modest resource investment,
Yeah.
in terms of the number of people working on a problem.
How do you balance, because this is a dichotomy that I think confuses a lot of leaders, is how do you balance burnout with running teams hot and really being motivated to accomplish way or punching way above their weight? Like, how do you manage those two dichotomies?
Yeah, I think the way I've always talked about it is there's a difference between stress and pressure. Pressure is actually really, really good. And I actually think most people like pressure because it forces them to get the best out of themselves, right? And
Yeah.
it helps you sort of, get clearer about what's important, what's not important, how you spend your time, how you shouldn't be spending your time. And so I think there's a difference between stress and pressure, and ideally where you want teams, and I think teams are most happiest,
Yeah.
frankly, even more happy than being bored, is when they're in that sort of like, I know there's a lot of pressure on me. The organization's expecting me to deliver.
Yeah.
I think that's great. It focuses, my energy.
Yeah.
Versus stress. And what happens when you get stressed is you see yourself cycling the same thing again and again and again, and you're not actually making forward progress.
Yeah.
And so, to me, the way I always looked at it is like, we want to make sure that the teams we have feel like there's pressure on them to deliver. There's
Yeah.
pressure on them to deliver on behalf of the customer, and I think that is generally healthy. And you can see it from the teams. The teams get excited. They're excited about what they're building when they're in that pressure zone. When they're in that stress zone, it generally moves away from excitement into like despair.
Yeah.
And rather than saying like, "Wow, that's a lot to get done. Let's figure out what we need to cut to make sure we're able to hit that date," which is
Yeah.
sort of someone in pressure. That's what they're thinking.
Yeah.
In the other scenario, it's like, "There's no way I can get that done," and they're just
Yeah.
like sort of head in the sand. And those are sort of the things that I look. Now it's different for everyone. Everyone, I think, exhibits this in different ways, and I think leaders need to know their teams and understand sort of and spend time with them too. I mean, this is
Yeah.
spending time in one-on-ones and really understanding how do you feel today and
Mm.
what's keeping you up and what are you worried about. Like these are I think important conversations you need to be
Yeah.
having as a leader. But to me, I think that's the way I always thought about it. It's like we do want teams to feel pressure. That's
Yeah.
good. That's healthy. That's what a high functioning organization is
Yeah.
doing. But they shouldn't feel like they're sort of despair and there's no way they're ever going to accomplish
Yeah.
this thing because that's not that doesn't lead to effective action. I think the number one thing though is creating that ownership. When
Yeah.
you create ownership, a lot of things that might have felt like despair don't feel that way because you feel like you're an owner. You feel like you're responsible for your outcome. And so that sort of earlier conversation around defining ownership allows you to 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 put people under some amount of pressure and them to actually feel great about
Yeah, so unpacking that, it sounds like the difference between despair and pressure are a couple of things. One is make sure that the person feels ownership on what they're doing actually affects the outcome. They don't feel
it. Yep.
like just no matter what they do doesn't affect the outcome. So that's ownership, and also having the right tools to get the job done. The second thing is just the amount of how much are you underwater, right? Just if you're way underwater and you have, let's say, 20 points to get done, but you only have time for like 8, there's no way you're going to catch up. And so amount of underwaterness seems to drive the difference between stress versus pressure. And then also feeling like the people and the team are there to help you succeed seems to be the other differentiator between somebody that's stressed versus somebody that's pressure. Is that right? Did I miss
Yeah.
anything?
Yeah, I think that's mostly it. I use a couple different techniques with the team to help sort of better understand where folks are.
Yeah.
Obviously, just chatting with your team and checking in is critical. But there are also we would look at like, all right, when a team started a sprint, some of this is team based and some of this is individuals. But when
Yeah.
teams started a sprint, like how much of their sprint was stuff that came in that they didn't plan for? How much is like, oh wow, this team is spending 60% of its sprint on things it hadn't thought of at the start of it. It's like, what's going on here? And oftentimes that's a sign that like one, the ownership's not clear, so that other teams are asking them for stuff they need, and or it's a sign that they're underwater. That there's a bunch of investments in critical scaling infrastructure they just didn't realize that they needed. And then the other thing I would do is I'd also sort of check in on how I was doing communicating what I thought were the company's goals, because I think some of this is also knowing that what you're working on is critical to the company. I think it's pretty important to help folks feel like they can tackle what's in front of them and that they have the support of the organization. And so, one of the things I started doing later on was sort of in my one-on-ones with the team, I'd say like, hey, what do you think are your top 3 goals? What do you think are the top 3 goals you think I have for you?
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like there could be no wrong answer. I would look the other way, let them write it on the whiteboard, and then we'd turn around and I would sort of have what my top 3 goals for them were. And we'd see like, is it the same or is it different?
Mm.
And it's not like anyone's in trouble if we're wrong. If anyone's in trouble, it's me because I haven't been communicating what I expected the team.
Yeah.
And so, we would basically do that as a sort of calibration exercise. And the first few times you do it, you'd be surprised. Like, some leader that's responsible for a really important area thinks what you think is important. They think a completely different set of things than you do as their manager, and it's like, wow, it's a good way to get to truth real quick, and then get everyone aligned, and for me to get feedback on how well I'm communicating what's important to the company too, and so that was sort of an exercise I also sort of adopted over the years to help me be a better leader and better at communicating what's important.
That makes sense. A lot of the communication gets lost in translation, and it's your reality, my reality, and then there's the real reality, and so that oftentimes gets convoluted. Do you think this idea of ownership versus thriving under pressure is a type of person, or do you think and we should be hiring for that quality, or do you think it is naturally present in most people on just how you manage people and the expectations you set in the communication?
Yeah, I think it's actually present in most people. I really do. I think that there's different people express it in very different ways, and I think that as a leader is something you need to be aware of. Is sometimes we look for the vocal leader, and sometimes there's someone in the background that's like very non-vocal, but really, really thrives under pressure. And so, but I think everybody has an element of this. I think the question is really comes down to around ownership over problems, and are we giving people the appropriate ownership, and do they have some autonomy to execute against that? I think if you solve for that, I think you'd be surprised at just how well everyone can perform around you. And I think when you fail to do that, I think honestly that it leads to stressed out teams because they feel like no matter what they do, they won't succeed because they don't have actual ownership over the outcome. Now, I think one of the things I've noticed about high performing folks is that they will usually call out very directly, like, you can't hold me accountable for that because I do not own it, right? And it's like, oh, great. And now we're having the conversation up front around like what it would mean to hold them accountable for a particular outcome and
Yeah.
what they would need to own in order to do that. And you sort of, and I think that's I think one of the things is that there's a set of folks that, at least in my experiences, are much more willing to sort of push back around ownership of areas they don't feel like
Yeah.
they can fully execute against, versus folks that oftentimes just sort of don't vocalize that, and you don't find out until the thing's kind of already not succeeded or it's off the
Yeah.
rails. And I think that's one big thing that I always encourage folks. It's like you got to speak truth to me, and I'm this is a safe place.
Yeah.
Any conversation is okay. If I've defined the problem wrong, I made plenty of mistakes around here, and
Yeah.
I do want to hear about it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a place where a lot of times folks don't know about that because they don't have sort of the open door policy, and they think, oh, well, the boss wants this, so I just need to do what the boss says.
Yeah.
I always tell folks, like, if you have a better idea, I want to hear about it.
Yeah.
If you don't, we need to execute together. Like, I don't want us to be debating every single thing, but if you think there's a better idea out there that we would all benefit from, great. Let's hear about it and discuss it.
Yeah, and I think being open to mistakes and learn, but make sure that people learn from it is another angle too. Like, obviously nobody ever gets hard things right the first time, right? And
Yeah.
it's a learning process for people. I think that's another thing that helps communicating to the team that it's okay to make mistakes and we'll learn from it, and we increase our velocity versus trying to not make any mistakes, not take any risks, and we're just kind of playing it safe every single time. One of the things that happens in product world is entropy, right? Which is how there is just the thing comes in, the requirement comes in, and everybody's clear what they're going to do. And then 8 weeks later or 10 weeks later, you end up in a place that everybody's wondering, how do we even get here? That's one type of entropy, right?
Yeah,
and I want to talk about that. Another one is, obviously, you want to get the best ideas from across the company into evaluation process. And how do you set it up that it's not creating a ton of noise, but it's actually creating the right diversity of ideas and ownership that it brings from the whole org? Because you want the whole org to be involved, invested in the product. And so how do you manage entropy effectively, whether it's when an idea comes in and it ends up in a completely different place, or just generally being able to get the best ideas out of the company without creating a ton of noise where signal to noise ratio is too high?
Yeah, I think the first type of entropy, I think what I discussed about spending more time up front defining the problem and what the success criteria looks like and what this will do for customers on the outside. I think that's usually when it occurs, when you start something and it's like completely different. What are we even doing here? Usually it means you didn't do the work up front. That to me is you've not distilled into the most simplest terms what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And it becomes confusing to the entire organization what you're trying to solve.
Yeah.
That to me is, I think, the best defense against that, is just really, really simply distilling down what you're trying to solve on behalf of customers before any work gets done. I think the second is quite different in terms of how you solve and I think it changes at different phases in the company. I think early on, the way I think about it is early on in the company, the vast majority of customers you're solving for are customers you do not yet have, right? And so when you think about like what's the ratio of stuff that is like come from us, that we have this vision, and it's like way more of what you're building should be from the vision of the founder and of the leadership team and sort of the agenda, the overall company vision, what you're trying to set out to solve, than
Yeah.
it should be from direct customer feedback because you don't have a ton of customers, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is sort of the thing that keeps you from, building the faster horse instead of going and building the car. And I think most companies, particularly startups, are sort of in that environment. And so,
Yeah.
but as the company shifts, as you start to have a ton of customers that are coming in, you need to basically change the mix.
Yeah.
How much of it should just be like our own view of what we think the future ought to be like
Yeah.
versus, the view of customers that are using this every day, telling us this is what they need. And so that mix needs to be, I sort of think of it as like a wine. You need different types of different amounts of any particular varietal for the different type of stage in the company. And so the way I think about it is like at the start, it's very much founder driven,
Yeah.
thesis driven. Where do you want the world to? What do you expect the world to look like 10 years from now?
Yeah.
And you're spending most of your time talking about the needs of customers you do not yet have, and you're trying to understand them, right? You're going out and talking to
Yeah.
folks. You're not designing in a silo, but it's about customers you do not yet have.
Yeah.
As you start having more and more customers, you need to actively engage in those customer channels. I think as a product
Yeah.
leader to distill things and to your point of like, how do you make this not be noisy? How do you make it not be? You need to come up with a sort of processes and systems that sort of help it not just be the loudest account manager that owns some big account that's really excited about one particular feature
Yeah.
shouldn't just be able to bully the organization and that's I think sort of one failure mode. Or the product manager that cares about their vision only shouldn't also be able to sort of bully the organization. So these different failure modes. And so what we did a few different things. One of them was we had a running we called it the top 10 list. And so our sort of sales/sales engineering organization had a customer top 10. These are, if we could only ask product for 10 things, this is
Yeah.
what we would want, right? Because
Yeah.
product manager can't be in every conversation. They're not in every account. They're not in and so, hey, great. These are the top 10. And in our organization, because we were a developer tool, it was typically a sales engineer spending time with the product managers to make sure they fully understood what that top 10 list was.
Yeah.
And then at the start of every quarter, I'd be asking the product managers, like, what are we doing from the sales top 10? Like,
Yeah.
are we making steady progress against the things they think are our most important customer needs? Because I think naturally the product managers are thinking about their roadmap, their vision, their like long-term thing, which is a good, you want them thinking about those things, but you can sort of ignore some of these. And then we did the same thing with customer support. Our customer support leader at the time was named Terry. We were like, all right, what's Terry's top 10? Like if Terry could get his, top 10 built this quarter, what would he want built? And so we had those always, and I
Yeah.
actually had the product managers responsible for those areas to actually have that in our sort of weekly status report. They just, they knew it. And then I'd be asking, what are we doing to address this quarter?
Yeah.
And then we had a sort of a more shared, larger tent forum where Terry was there, and the sales engineering leaders were there, where we could discuss these issues and make sure that they weren't getting starved. But I think you need to you need to actively create a process
Yeah.
as you get more and more customer feedback to ensure that the right voices are heard.
Yeah.
And frankly, we even ended up in a spot where it's like finance kind of at some point, as we got to a certain size, like they cared about when's this pricing update going out? How are we communicating this change? When are we implementing the sales tax in this state? And they have a different set of needs, right? And so you want to make sure there's a forum, but you also want to give those teams a means to prioritize for themselves.
Yeah.
Because if they aren't sort of in that bucket where you're asking them to prioritize, we live in, I just told you I like to have teams that were, very, very we run them hot, and so there's always a resource constraint. And so you need to both help those teams be in a spot where they're not just asking, I need this, I need this, I need this.
Yeah.
It's like, no, which of these do you need the most?
Yeah.
If I could do one or two things, which would it be? And then we had a historical record too, because we had it in our sort of weekly report. It's like, okay, this thing's been on Terry's list for 6 months. It's been number one. Like, why have we not done it? And what are we doing to fix that? And those were the type of conversations we'd have as a team.
Yeah, I really like that distinction. Actually, it's a very helpful one, which is before product market fit, where you're actually creating a vision, going and ask people what they want. For example, if you ask members like, how would you want us to be a partner in your health, for the next 10 years? It'd be a very hard question for people to answer. So before that product market fit, really working on the vision and obviously having a pathway to test your ideas once you, as you
For
said, like
sure.
press release and mocks and interviews, so get more confidence. But it seems like heavy there. And then once you hit product market fit, then it becomes really important to make sure that we make the features that people find useful or find as friction and addressing those while we're adding to the future looking bets, which are less
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that you shouldn't be afraid as an organization to make cultural changes to how you do things to ensure this is just naturally happens. We had folks do customer support tickets at a periodic interval too. So it's like next thing I know, it's like I'm VP of product, but I'm answering our support tickets around how do I send this message in into the UK and so you're seeing that direct customer feedback along with the support team rather than pushing the problem away from your product organization. You want it to be something that they're able to see quite closely.
yeah.
And we worked on that. Another time we had a series of outages that were really, really painful for our customers. And so we put the product managers on call. We said, listen, I realize you're not, going to be restarting servers and, you're not going to be writing, quick hotfix for code, but like you should be managing communication with customer support
Yeah.
while engineering is getting things back online, and you should be writing the RFO that goes to a very upset customer, and you should
Yeah.
feel the pain of service availability just like our customers do and just like the engineers here do. And so I think you need to be willing to prioritize even cultural changes in how you do things as the company progresses and as you're in a different stage in terms of having customers versus not having customers.
Yeah, and we've been good at that where we have an everybody on support thing that anybody that joins the company will spend a ton of time with support and actually going through
It's great.
tickets and they really understand and build that empathy, which is important. You're right. If you're just hearing from other people, it's very different than when you actually read the comments in its entirety from customers and or you're actually helping respond to some of these things. It creates a different level of empathy and it's so visceral that one of the things I know we're up on time here. Just maybe we can.
I can run over by a few minutes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. One of the things is the bike shedding that kills most startups, right? Which is we can make that graph as beautiful, and everybody has an opinion on the graph, right? That you've created, and you could spend a ton of engineering time on that graph. Or where you're pre-PMF where you decide to kill a bunch of features that a number of people liked, and you're going to get a lot of grief from externally and internally about killing these features. How do you, first of all, what's your viewpoint on that? Like when you have to make changes that some people are just going to hate, right? And it could be some of your best customers, unfortunately. How do you think about that in your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think to do all these things well, you need to have a very, very clear idea of where you want to be. Both sort of 10 years out, which typically the sort of CEO vision level of the company, and fortunately at Twilio, Jeff was phenomenal at sort of setting that this is where we should be 10 years from now. But then you need to also be able to work backwards from that to things that allow you to make decisions, because frequently that's not useful for making decisions. It's useful for understanding general direction, but you then want to sort of work backwards from it. It's like, okay, if we want to be here in 10 years, where do we need to be 18 months from now? Where do we need to be, 4 years from now? Where do we need? And having that clear view of where you're going and then the steps that you need to take along the way then allows you to evaluate some of these questions from the perspective of like, are we getting closer or further away from that vision? And I think that's the frame that I would do when you have to make those hard decisions. And oftentimes you end up funding initiatives that maybe seem questionable at that time because it's in further of that vision. And I actually think it's really, really important to be explicit around not just what you're doing, but why you are doing it. And I can sort of think of a conversation, around Twilio when we invested in our video product. Early on, it was not a big revenue driver. And there were a lot of questions. Hey, we're spending a lot of money on this. It's not driving revenue on day one. And why are we doing that? And the question is like, well, we had this mission to fuel the future communications that Jeff had sort of outlined for the company. And it's like, we don't believe we'll be fueling the future communications if we're not fueling video communications. It's like full stop. Like that is part of what we're trying to do here.
Yeah.
And so the question shouldn't be around why are we doing video. It should be maybe we're investing too heavily right now, but
Yeah.
we do 10 years from now we need to be doing this. And so I think when you have a really clear vision from the CEO, and then you have and I saw my role as a product leader to take just super clear. Here's where we need to be in 10 years.
Yeah.
To ask what we need to be in 5 years, what
Right.
all the way down to sort of where do we need to be in 18 months,
Yeah.
and then task my team with like what are we doing in the next year, in your area that you own, and how is it contributing to this thing that is where we need to be in 18 months. That's I think the thing that allows you to make those decisions much more easily, because occasionally some things will come up and you'll be like, is this part of fueling the future of communication? We're like, no. It's like, all right, well then
Right.
why should we be doing it? And it's like, and sometimes you still do those things. It's like, hey, there's a ton of revenue in this. It's like, well, great. That revenue is going to help us fuel the future of communications, right? But sometimes you say like, no, it isn't actually contributing, and there's no revenue. It's like, all right, then maybe we shouldn't be spending our time on these things, and
Yeah.
and those can be hard decisions. But I think ultimately it benefits the company.
Have you ever made a decision specifically of killing a feature or adding a feature, and then there's a ton of pressure to either bring it back? Let's take killing a feature because that's hard. That has inertia in it, and you got a ton of pressure from people that you've got to bring that back. But you were, based on your North Star metrics or the way you saw the product evolving, you made the call that no, we're going to stick with it, even with a ton of pressure from both customers and internal.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that it did happen, but it usually happened in way tinier batches. So, when we were building things out, we sort of very clear alpha, beta, GA.
Yeah.
And in that alpha phase is where this happens the most. And that's where it should happen. By the time you've sort of made it available for folks, and even if it's not got an SLA against it or whatever, it's like you probably should have already gotten through this thing. But yeah, occasionally we'd be in that sort of alpha phase. We'd go down a path. Along that path, we'd come up with a better idea, right? Or a different way to solve that problem. Or we'd decide, hey, there's not enough customers that need this, or they're solving it some other way. And we'd say, hey, we're going to have to shut this down. And it's definitely difficult when you make those decisions. And I think the biggest thing you do to do that well is have a sort of tight-knit set of customers that you're willing to experiment with, and they know that you're willing to experiment with them. And there's high degree of trust with them. What's that?
Basically external beta customers.
Yeah, they're sort of external beta customers, and there's a lot of trust. And it's, in those instances, a lot of this ends up being relationship based, which is like, hey, I know we built this thing. We know that you built this other thing that's on top of it. We need to tear it down. We just need to see how we can help you best transition away. And we're making our own personal commitment, despite the fact that like that's time and resources that maybe we shouldn't spend otherwise. When you look at the value of that customer and that relationship in the long term, it tends to pay off. But yeah, there are plenty of things where we're like, hey, we wrote this new adapter that you can run and host because we don't think this should be part of Twilio, but like we realize you need it now because we didn't ship that thing. And so there were a number of those sort of experiences that happened along the way. Listen, they're never easy. I think the best way you can sort of handle that with customers is to help them understand why you think that's important and where you want to go with where the company is going and where the technology is going. And I think that's useful for them, because I think as much as when someone makes a bet on your product, particularly in the API business, they're really betting on your company and your team too, right? You're part of their product usually in the API world, in the infrastructure world. And so it's like they're making as big a bet on us as a team as they are on the product that they're using. Yeah. And the more they have confidence that you understand what their needs are, and you also understand where the long term is going, the more they'll go on that journey with you. But yeah, there's many tough conversations that happen.